My name is Benjamin Smith. I was born in Petersburg, Virginia in 1926.
Now you wound up, what, in the Army Air Corps?
Was in the Army Air Corps from July of 1944 until June of 1946.
Did you go right into service after you got out of school, or when did you go in?
I was drafted originally, and when I got out of school, I went to University of Virginia. I was there until 1950. When the Korean War broke out, I was in a VA hospital in Richmond, Virginia, had a knee operation from an old injury. And 9 months later, I was at Parris Island, North Carolina, in Marine Corps boot.
Oh my gosh. We're going to go back just a little bit here. But tell us a little bit about being in the Army Air Corps, and where were you stationed at?
Originally, went through Shepherd Field, Texas for basic training. After Shepherd Field, came up to Lowry in the fall of '44. Graduated from B-17 Armament School, and about Christmas went to Kingman, Arizona for B-17 gunnery.
What kind of a training thing was it at Lowry? Was it pretty intensive at Lowry?
Yes, it was. In fact, there were so many classes out there and so many people, you had a hard time getting into Denver on the Liberty because various classes had different days they could be off. And it was a concentrated course. It was a B-17 armament course, and learning how to the armament on a B-17 craft.
Did they teach you all areas of all the gun placements on a B-17?
Yes. Of course, the main armament was a .50 caliber machine gun. And then, of course, we learned loading bombs and so forth. From Lowry Field, went into Kingman, Arizona for gunnery training.
How long were you down there?
Probably altogether 3 months. But we had graduated probably in 2 months, and then there was such a backlog of gunners that they sent us up to Grand Canyon in an Air Force rest camp.
I have a couple more questions going back to Lowry and the gunnery school.
Yeah, well, Lowry was the armament school.
Armament school.
Uh-huh.
I was going to ask, did you fly out of Lowry or do any flight training out of Lowry?
No, out of Kingman only. Everything at Lowry was ships they had placed at Lowry to practice on, to learn on. And when we got to Kingman Air Force Base, through gunnery training, we flew B-17s.
What position on the 17 were you?
I took training in the chin turret, but actually, you had every position during gunnery school. The lower ball, they called it, was the lower gun emplacement. The upper ball, which was the top, and the tail gunner, and the waist gunner. And the chin turret, of course, was a replacement for the old handheld twin 50s they had in the front of the B-17s.
Could you describe a little bit of how they trained you when you were in the air with the gunnery practice?
Yeah, we had tow targets that we shot at. They had something that was brand new to everybody at the time. It was a large building where you had simulated, and they had actual pictures of fighter planes coming towards you, and you had, I don't know what we were flying, air, I guess is what it was, you took a turn on a turret, which duplicated the one that was on the plane, and they would show these films, and you would shoot at the planes as they came in. And you were able to tell how well you were doing by the films. We also had, on some of the positions of the actual flights, we had cameras, and we would fire only the camera at these planes that were doing pursuit curves toward us and so forth.
So you have pretty good feedback about how well you were actually doing with the training.
I'm sorry.
You had pretty good feedback about how well you were.
Oh yeah, the next morning they would show you the films on how you did. And I always did better than I thought I did. And most guys did. Because we were new and you were learning, and you didn't have the actual guns to fire, it was the cameras you were firing. Except when we shot at tow targets.
When you were shooting at the tow targets, did you know anything about the pilots who were flying those planes?
We didn't know them, no. In fact, the co-pilots on the B-17s were air cadets who had not yet graduated from pilot school. And once we got up in the air, they would let these guys take over.
The reason we ask about that is the only person we've met that flew a tow target plane was one of the women pilots that they had.
I don't know if that was true where we were, because if they were, I didn't see them. I didn't know them.
Okay, well, they used women in a lot of these.
Yes, they did.
And we were occasionally, there weren't many accidents, I don't think, but some of them did occasionally take some bullets and.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that at Kingman. And after that, we came back and were shipped out to Luke Field, Arizona, with the provision that we were going to enter B-29 gunnery school. From Luke Field, we went to Ajo, Arizona, as armorers, because by this time the war in Europe was over in May of '45. So we were replacing the old timers who were manning Ajo Air Force Base.
When did the war end for you then?
In August of '45, I was at Ajo, and the war with Japan was over.
Did you get out of service then?
No, we went up to Kearns, Utah, with the idea that we would be shipping overseas. But by the time we got up there, we were old timers. So they made us permanent party, processing the records of the kids still going overseas. And these were replacement troops for the old timers.
So did the war kind of end then for you as far as?
Well, in August '45, the war was over. And again, we stayed up in Kearns from approximately Christmas of '45 until I was released in June of '46.
That wasn't the end of your military experience.
No. Again, I was in a military hospital, a VA hospital, in summer of 1950, and my knee dislocated, and I had to have surgery to correct it. And while I was in the hospital, the Korean War broke out. And for some reason or the other, I thought, I want to go. So I tried to enlist several months after I got out of the hospital, but they had a provision that you had to have 1 year after knee surgery with no problems. I ended up getting a waiver after 9 months. So in March, at the end of March '51, I went to Marine Corps boot camp.
Was that more than you expected?
No, I'd heard so much about it because some of my peers who had been in World War II had been in the Marine Corps, so I knew pretty well what to expect. But I was prepared for it, And I was one of 2 section leaders in my platoon because I'd had previous service. Had to do the same thing everyone else did, except I had the opportunity to assign duties and so forth.
What happened after your boot camp?
After boot camp, I went to radio school at San Diego, California. And probably late fall, went to Camp Pendleton for combat training. And by the end of January, I was on a troop ship to Korea.
Where did they send you right away?
Pardon?
Where did they send you in Korea?
Well, I got to Korea after stopping at Kobe, Japan, and they rearranged the troop ship to the units you're going to in Korea. So I ended up in the headquarters of the 2nd Regiment of the 11th Marines, 2nd Battalion of the 11th Regiment. They moved the 1st Marine Division from the eastern sector into the western sector at the end of March 1952. At the time, I volunteered to go on an artillery forward observer team. And when we got to the West Coast, I joined the forward observer team.
What did you do as a forward observer?
Well, what we do is look for targets, enemy targets. There's 6 men on a team. I was a radio man because I'd taken radio training in San Diego. And when I got to be an FO, the group I was with was in reserve. The 2nd Battalion was in reserve. And you're assigned as an FO to a Marine company. And the Marine company was in reserve. But we still were manning outposts across the river from the Chinese. So we spotted targets for about a month. We were by ourselves, 6 men on a hill. And we had a recon force in front of us. Recon force was normally not assigned to one regiment and so forth, but they were considered an elite outfit. So they were in front of us. We rarely saw them because they were right across the river from the Chinese.
What kind of guns did you have?
We shot 105 millimeters. We had access to firing 155s.
Did you do a lot of firing there?
Yeah, we did. We could see the Chinese. We had they call it a battery commander scope. It's powerful binoculars actually on a stand. And there were occasions that we saw individual Chinese, maybe 4 or 5, 6 or 7 together. And more in practice than anything, we would fire on them. A couple of times they fired on us, but they didn't really see us, I don't think, because we were we were on a hill by ourselves and pretty well camouflaged. About June of 1952, the infantry company that we were assigned to went online. And most of them were on a hill overlooking Panmunjom where the peace talks were. So we joined 2 of the platoons on an OP called Combat Outpost 2, where we were looking right down on the peace talk tents. We used to see the delegates going back and forth by helicopter every day.
Well, that must have been
Well, I think that's the thing. We were right there. We knew, nobody knew any more than we did as far as what was happening at the moment. We had the author, James Michener, visit our outpost one day. And he was making a tour of the Marine outfits in Korea. And we fired a mission for him.
That's
When you see all these dignitaries, generals coming in and out to the peace talks, were there a lot of rumors or scuttlebutt at the time as to what might be happening? Whenever you saw
Yeah,
these?
actually, we didn't know as much as the people in the States, really, because the knowledge didn't filter down to our level. One day, the chief delegate, I think his name was Harrison, General Harrison, stopped by because he used to see our position when he went in the helicopter every day. So they took him out there to show him what we were doing and so forth. But we first started going to Outpost 2, we would retreat to another outpost that was near the no-fire zone. We'd spend the night there, and then the next morning, we would go out to OP2 until the fortifications were built up. And from OP2, several raids against the Chinese were conducted, some of which we went on and others we didn't. In July 3rd of 1952, we had a raid on a Chinese hill called Yoke to capture a prisoner, is what we were told. To make a long story short, no prisoner was captured, but we had, I would say, almost 50% casualties, mostly wounded by two of the platoons who were assaulting this position.
How many troops do you think you were up against, the Chinese?
I'm sorry?
How many troops do you think you were up against the Chinese?
Well, I've seen a lot of reports on that battle, and there was a lot more in the reports than I saw. So I'm not sure whether there was a company or what. And we didn't know anything about it until after the war was over. And the combat diaries were published, and we gave the official version in these combat diaries. Sometimes jibed with what I remembered, and sometimes not. But we did one interesting thing. When we were pulling off the hill the next morning, because we'd been up all night, coming down on the trail, a Marine went down in front of me, and I was right behind him, maybe 4 or 5 yards. And I went up to him, and another Marine had turned him over, and his helmet had fallen off. And it was a fellow that I knew in boot camp, casual, and didn't know he was with the company. And he'd been shot in the back. The bullet went right through his flak vest. And he was praying. And I recognized this fellow. And I told him, his name was Ray Lux. And I said, Ray, you're going to be okay. Didn't know what happened to Ray until almost 50 years later. I was going through Washington, D.C., and I called a number given to me by a woman who said said she was the daughter of Ray Lux. And Ray answered the phone, and he didn't remember a thing about that day. And every time I'd go through D.C., I'd call his home, and he'd always be there. And one day I called, I went through D.C., the woman answered the phone, and I said, "Can I speak to Ray, please?" And she said, "Well, Ray died 2 weeks ago." And she said, "You knew he was paraplegic, didn't you?" And I said, "No, I didn't. He never said that he was." But he had come home and had gone through intensive hospitalization, had gotten so that he could actually have controls that he could drive a car. But I never knew. I knew he had a horrific wound, but I didn't know how bad. And so I never got to see him after.
But it was good you got to talk to him.
Pardon?
It was good you got to talk to him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In that kind of combat, what do you remember about that? Personally, what happened to you during that combat?
Well, we were with the Artillery Forward Observer team. We were not with the platoons that were assaulting the hill. We were maybe 125, 150 yards on a hill overlooking this other hill. So we got shot at because several instances, I remember some kids around us got hit. But we didn't go with the assaulting team up this hill because we had no purpose. There were several instances where kids were getting hit, and it was like a dream to me, looking over at this hill that was being attacked by young Marines, 18 and 19 years old. And the courage, I just couldn't absorb it. Here these kids are within minutes of death, and they're so brave that they'd been told to go up this hill, and they did. One of the machine gun squad leaders took over one of the platoons in the attacking force after the platoon leader had been wounded, and through his actions, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. But anyway, coming back, it was a hot day, well over 100 degrees. And we got back to the Panmunjom Peace Road where there was no firing allowed. And we walked back out to Outpost 2 where we had come from. And the word came down that every Marine who was able had to go back out to the battle site the next night to recover a Marine's body who had been overlooked. They called them KIAs, killed in action. So I thought, uh-oh. But anyway, there weren't a lot of us left from the original attacking force, maybe 50% of the guys. So as soon as night came, we assembled right at the foot of OP2. And just as we were all gathering, one of the young platoon leaders was being led away by a couple of MPs. And he was shouting, "They're killing my boy, Skipper." And the skipper said, the captain of the company said, "They're my boys too." So they took the platoon leader away. We never saw him again. And a Korean dog accompanied us. It was dark by that time. Accompanied us all the way up, back up to a hill called Three Fingers. But we didn't find the boy's body.
As a radio man, or as an observer, did you get a chance to see how effective your barrages were?
Yes, we did. And sometimes you didn't, though, because I remember one morning, the Forward Observer officer was a lieutenant, and there were 5 other Marines on the team. I remember one morning, we were on OP2, and our officer spotted, for some reason, Chinese in the daytime open, out in the open. So he fired on them, and it was like shooting turkeys, I guess. You'd call it a turkey shoot. It was very unusual that you would see them in the daytime. And we observed quite a few casualties that day. Most of the time, if the mission was fired at night, covering a raid or something, we could not really observe the casualties. But the raiding force could pretty well determine how effective it was. We covered several raids where we did a lot of good, protecting the infantry who were exposed to machine gun and mortar fire.
The radios that you had, they were portable radios, but they were pretty big, weren't they?
In those days they were. I think they said that you had a battery as big as the radio. I think they claimed it was a 40-pound with a backpack. And it's not like, not like now when you have something that you can hold in your hand. And that was cumbersome to me because the other guys, two of the men were wiremen, and they carried these big spools of wire. Most of the communication was done over the wires rather than the radio. That way, the Chinese couldn't pick up our signal through a radio because we weren't communicating.
Did the wires get cut a lot with artillery? And
Yes, they did. And you could always determine previous Marine patrols by the communication wire that was on the rice paddy trails that you were following. Because when the mission was over, you would cut the wire because it was useless after that time. So maybe if you saw a dozen or 2 dozen wires, you knew another patrol had preceded you.
Were the radios reliable?
Yes, when we needed them. We didn't use it often, but it was a case where the wires had been cut through, say, artillery fire, or the South Korean villagers had cut them up to bind their straw huts together.
When you were observing and you noticed an enemy position, how quickly could you get information back to the battery and have them put rounds onto the target?
It was almost immediate. Our FO officer did most of the firing. We had a scout sergeant who backed him up in case he was needed. But you would see an enemy force, and you had to have a minimum, I can't remember what it was now, 11 or 19 or something, actual enemy, or you had to have an emplacement that you were firing on. But it was almost immediate. I remember one time when our officer caught a bunch of the Chinese out in the open, and he had called in a mission, and I was on the wire phone relaying his information, and he exclaimed, he said, after the original salvo was fired, he let out an exclamation, almost of joy. He said, one of the rounds exploded right on top of the troopers. And I repeated this to the guy I was talking to on the FDC, which is the Fire Direction Center. But he was busy apologizing somebody at the firing battery that he had dropped the ball. I don't know what he was talking about. But I wrote it up and I said, no matter what he thought he had done, it was a very effective mission.
How far forward were you from the
Well, when I got over to Korea in February, it was a stalemate. And we had the main lines of resistance for the Chinese and the main line of resistance for the Marines. And in between were the outposts. And that's where the battles were fought when I was over there. In between the two MLRs. And the biggest battle that I was in, or adjacent to, I wasn't actually on the hill, was called Bunker Hill. And the Chinese had taken a marine hill called Siberia, and the Marines in turn had taken Bunker Hill, or were attempting to take Bunker Hill. And it was a big battle. I was in reserve at the time, and our FO team that had been put together that morning when we were called back replaced the troops who were fighting on Bunker Hill. But that was a tremendous battle for several weeks. By the time we were there, you were fighting the same troops for several weeks at a time. You have to understand, we sent patrols out from some units every night. And our company, they would send patrols out. It could have been a squad-size patrol, maybe just a few guys. But the Chinese were very adept at setting ambushes, mainly because you were in the same positions for months. You were in the same area. And one of the ways they could tell was our comm wire. They could tell when they sent their patrols out at night where our comm wire was, so they knew there was a lot of activity on the rice paddy trail. And they had several ambushes set up, very effective. And of course, Marines, they didn't have that advantage of the comm wire for the Chinese, because they shot off fireworks. I remember going on several patrols, and all of a sudden you'd see these beautiful fireworks from the hills around you, and they were signaling where we were and what we were, how far we were going, and so forth. At Panmunjom, there was a searchlight to let both sides know where they weren't supposed to be, and they shot vertically up in the air. So you knew by this searchlight relatively where you were, and the Chinese could tell where you were when they were observing you from this searchlight.
Could you use the fireworks to tell where the Chinese were and target them?
I'm sorry?
Could you use the fireworks to tell where the Chinese were
Oh,
and
no.
target them? Okay.
No. Panmunjom was the center of the no-fire zone. And again, that's why that searchlight was set up there. OP2 was 3.5 to 4 miles in front of our main line of resistance. The only thing that made it almost invulnerable was it was near the Peace Road that went out to Panmunjom. So many of the time during the day, you could look behind you and to the side of you and see the Chinese troops watching you from these hills. And people have asked me, well, why didn't you fire on them? They were very, very knowledgeable about our artillery, which was howitzers, which fired up and over. They weren't direct fire. So they used to say, well, you were watching these guys watching you, why didn't you fire on them? They knew our guns. When they heard boom, 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 they knew that something was going to come right after it, and that was the projectile. So you couldn't catch them that way.
Were you at that position until the end of the war?
About August, our battalion and company went off the line into reserve. And they had a rotating reserve. There were 3 Marine regiments, and within the regiments, they had rotating companies. So we had been online with George Company, say from June through late August, as I recall. And right before I was rotated, I was in reserve with George Company. I left Korea early because before we left the States, after training at Camp Pendleton, Marine reservists, which I was, who had previous service, were being released. To go with the replacement draft, you had to sign an extension that you would have at least 8 months to serve. So I and another former Army guy had extended our period so we could go overseas. So I left early also. So I came home at the 1st of September and was released immediately when we got to San Francisco. We came into San Francisco and processed the draft. It was a original replacement draft, came back intact except for the casualties. And most of the Marines signed up for 3 or 4 years and they stayed in. But I had 18 months active service, which suited me fine because I had gotten into the war for some reason which I wanted to do. Still ask myself why, and went home.
What was the reception when you got home? People, were they aware of what you?
Oh, it was very unusual because the guys my age were normally the World War II guys, and not many guys my age. I was 26, I think, when I got home. There weren't a lot of Marines from my hometown. There were some younger Army people in there, but life just resumed as it had. There weren't the bad feelings, say, of the Vietnam people. I never heard a negative thing at all.
Have you gotten together with reunions for your?
Yeah, a couple of reunions. The 1st Marine Division Association. I've been to a couple of the reunions and saw some of the people I was with. A lot of them have passed on.
Was it good to get back and find these guys?
I'm sorry?
Was it good to see these guys after that?
Yes, it was. It was. And we all had changed 50-some years later. And again, I was in contact with maybe 4 or 5 of them. And 3 of them have passed on. And I don't go to reunions anymore. Really, when you get there are very few key people you were with. There are other Marines, but they were usually with other outfits, which you didn't have much to do with.
What's it like to see a B-17 flying today?
Oh, looking at this B-17 several times, every time they have one in Denver, I try to make it. It's just entirely different. Everything's electronic now on the planes, where on the B-17 almost everything was hand done, except the turret guns. But yeah, a tremendous difference. There's nothing like that plane. Again, I think I told you, my brother was a co-pilot and he was shot down in one. And he goes to the 490th Bomb Group reunions almost every year now. And very close-knit group.
You said he was a POW.
He was a POW for 30 days, a little over 30 days, because he gets the benefits because he was over 30 days a prisoner.
And there was one little thing, there was a police chief that was in the prison camp with him, a police chief.
The story was at the time, and I don't know if I showed you and I'll show it to you after we're done here. The grandson of this police chief of the Amsterdam, Amsterdam in the Netherlands, was with my brother and about 14 other Allied POWs. And his picture is shown when they were released, all these guys together. And his grandson, for some reason, who lives in Ireland, or did live in Ireland, had sent out something on a World War II forum asking if anyone was still around who had been with his grandfather, and he described this police chief. And my brother, after he got home, sent packages back to Europe because they had a hard time after the war. And included was packages to this police chief. His grandson was trying to find out the story because his grandfather, who was a prisoner of war, wouldn't talk about it. And he was trying to find out the story of why. And my brother said there was no great mystery about it because the war was almost over and the German troops in the Netherlands were in effect cut off from their homeland in Germany. They couldn't send their prisoners to Germany because they would be trying to go through Allied lines. So they sent them to this island off of the coast called Terschelling, which was a German radar site. And it's right on the sea. And the grandson seemed to think there was some great mystery while they were sent out to Terschelling, and it really wasn't. It was just the closest place, and would probably have been a lot better for them to be out there than trying to get back to Germany or even reaching Germany, because Hitler, apparently at the end of the war, had said you should shoot the Allied airmen who parachute out and kill them, and that happened.
Do you have anything?
I don't, but I think we've covered a lot of that. It's ironic, you mentioned sending the packages overseas to Holland after the war. My mother's family in Iowa did the same thing with a Dutch family.
I'll be
And
done.
they became good friends with this family that's lasted 40, 50 years afterwards. And people,
That's interesting,
and
very
they've come
interesting.
over and visited us, and I stayed with them for about 3 or 4 days over there. And it's all because of the care packages that were sent.
Right, and they were really hard up in those days.